Let me just ask the state, you offered him as an expert. Are you objecting to him offering opinions in those areas?
Well, I think maybe just for the clarity of the record and the clarity of myself, Your Honor, what is he being offered as an expert in specifically?
Okay, could you go through that again, Mr. Robles?
Although I haven't laid the entire foundation for it, so I want the court to understand that. As an expert in police patrol procedures, SWAT team procedures, the use of force, including the use of less lethal and deadly force, police and SWAT team training, as well as hostage negotiations.
As long as it's limited to training and not the principles underlying the training, Your Honor, the state does not object.
Okay. He will be allowed to offer opinions in those areas?
There was a question that was pending, and let's see if I can remember how it was asked. Based on your training and experience, what is your view on the need to always tell the truth when negotiating with someone who's in crisis or a critical situation?
The general guidelines are that a negotiator doesn't want to be caught in anything that the subject would consider a lie. So the training is, and the training that we did was similar to New York's, that generally you do not depart from the truth or lie when you're negotiating. However, it is a tool when other verbal strategies have failed, and it is not wrong to do, and it has saved lives. And I can provide you with examples of that.
Would you please explain, provide the court with an example that explains how the use of a falsehood, a lie, in negotiations is proper for its use?
Yes, I can. In 1983, an abortion clinic was invaded by a man named James Bomar, who was on parole for violent crimes in the past. And he held women in the abortion clinic hostage. He had already murdered somebody else, and that was discovered about 2 hours into the negotiations. The negotiations ran for 13 hours. Eventually, the negotiator was given direction by me, because I was the SWAT commander and our negotiations were inside SWAT. And he was given direction by me to begin to establish a delivery of a vehicle, to provide this individual with a vehicle and give him the information that we were going to allow him to go with 2 of the hostages. That was sold to James Bomar, and the vehicle was parked where he wanted it. And when he exited the abortion clinic, he had hidden himself with surgical caps, gowns, and masks on himself and the hostages, so they all looked the same. We exercised what's called a vehicle assault, and we shot and killed James Bomar in the car and rescued the hostages. Had we not done that, it was our fear that we didn't give James Bomar what he wanted and didn't tell him we'd let him go and give him the vehicle, that he would kill the women and kill himself, because he knew what he had already done and knew what the results would be if he just surrendered to the police.
Now, I'd like to turn your attention back to the work that you did with the Deadly Force Training Program. Now, is it fair to say that you actually authored some of the training manuals and outlines that were involved in the use of force training you did?
Yes, sir, I did.
And would it be also fair to say that in developing those outlines, those training manuals, you did a lot of research about why the manuals or why the training should be what it was?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Turning your attention now to a different work that you did. I understand you're an adjunct faculty at the Fullerton College for Police Training. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
How many years were you part of the adjunct faculty?
I've been there now for approximately 11 years, I believe.
And what courses do you teach at the Fullerton College Police Academy, or Police Training Academy?
One is, I teach Police Fear, it's called, and it was adapted by California and required by California police officer standards and training. And so that class I teach. And then the utilization of specialized police equipment, from body armor to less lethal tools. And I also teach that for a manufacturer that makes less lethal equipment. I train officers to become instructors in less lethal equipment.
Now, I understand that you're a master instructor for less lethal instructor training, is that right?
That's right.
What exactly does it mean to be a master instructor in teaching the use of less lethal tools?
If you're the master instructor, in their terminology, identifies me as somebody not only that can train police officers, but train police officers how to be teachers and instructors.
So what specifically do you do as a, first as a instructor of less lethal, and then what does a master instructor do that's different than just a simple instructor in less lethal?
Well, teaching police officers the utilization of less lethal alternatives, whether it's a distraction device or OC spray or some kind of impact tool, you teach them the operational techniques to utilize it and the limitations of it and how to use it professionally and appropriately. To teach instructors, then you have to teach them how to teach, and you also have them provide student teaching that you evaluate, and they teach back and do a 10-minute lesson plan and a 10-minute teach back to the class. And then you also train them in how to run a range safely with a variety of different equipment, from chemical agents to OC spray to the things I've mentioned before.
I forgot.
So it's all a little bit more expansive to teach trainers.
I forgot to ask you, what experience do you have teaching law enforcement officers the use of a firearm?
The use of what?
A firearm, a deadly weapon.
Okay. Well, first of all, we train them in weapons manipulation, the very basic part of it. And if they don't have that skill, you would. And then advanced officers, you teach them the kinds of things that they need to know in terms of weapons manipulation, speed reloads, tactical reloads with pistols, with assault weapons, with a sniper rifle, because that's totally different. And then you teach them the different kinds of shooting positions, shooting on the move, left, right, forward, backward. The difference in distance and the difference in what we utilize in terms of weaponry. There are different functions. For example, a firearm that is carried in a holster, a pistol, is a defensive weapon. It's portable and it's used in an emergency. We generally don't use that for anything long range, generally. An officer may be forced to use it long range, but that's not what we generally teach. And then the other weapons that patrol officers carry, a longer weapon, whether it be a M4, that's a weapon that we use for distance. It has a longer sight radius, so therefore the officer, if he's utilizing it correctly, is going to be firing fewer rounds and be more precise at a long distance. The whole purpose is, number one, citizen safety. That's our first criteria. Second criteria is the safety of officers. And the third criteria is that we won't violate the subject's constitutional rights, but we may have to use force to arrest them.
Now, I just want to be clear, these are areas and topics that you have personally taught throughout the years.
Yes, sir, and I personally did develop that one.
Okay.
That was
Now, you
something
began.
I developed.
I apologize for interrupting. Is it fair to say that you began training the use of firearms back when you were with the LAPD?
Yes, sir.
You also did that at the Central Training Academy.
Yes, sir.
And then the focus of your training with the Deadly Force Training Program was exactly what officers should be taught about when it is appropriate to use deadly force.
That's correct.
Now, I understand that you're also an instructor for a number of tactical organizations, and I believe that one is the National Tactical Officers Association, Florida SWAT Association, and there's another one. I think it's called the Texas Police Officers Association or Texas Tactical Police Officers Association. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
What kind of training do you provide for these tactical organizations?
I provide a variety of different kinds of training. I have done less lethal training for them. I do tactical management and how to run a SWAT team, how to run a SWAT call-out, depending upon what it is, how to serve search warrants if you're a SWAT team, the different tactics and techniques, what are our choices, what's the first choice, the second choice, the third choice. And so, and that would all depend on the information presented to the police officer.
How recently have you taught these courses?
I am going to be teaching at the National Tactical Officers Association on August 31st. And I'll be teaching at the Florida Association in November.
Now, I understand that you now work as a consultant with R.M. McCarthy and Associates. Is that right?
Yes.
What kind of services does your business provide?
I do expert witness work, similar to what's going on here today. I also do independent reviews of incidents when organizations ask me. For example, I have done the Branch Davidian incident that occurred in Waco, Texas at the request of the U.S. Attorney General. I was part of that. The World Trade Organization riots in Seattle, the mayor and the city commissioned me to do a review of that incident. And then things that aren't as well known as that, that involve use of force or deadly force. And in that, I'm doing an evaluation of what the department did, what the officers did, and what created the issues that exist, if there are any.
Now, you've written a number of publications. Is that also correct?
Yes, sir.
And I'd just like to ask you about some of them, not all of them. I understand in 1986 you wrote Tactical Shooting and Modern Techniques of Pistol and Subgun for the Tactical Edge.
Yes, sir.
You also wrote Reasonable and Unreasonable Fear in Police Encounters. These are training keys, and they are a publication of the International Association of Chiefs of Police.
Yes, sir.
What exactly did you cover in this document, or I should say paper, called Reasonable and Unreasonable Fear in Police Encounters?
The material identifies the fact that there are officers who will respond to chaos or a significant event that is loud, noisy, and respond to it and be dominated by emotion, fear.
Your Honor, this is precisely the kind of opinion testimony that I think we have already made clear we do not want this witness giving. What people do under certain circumstances, how they perceive events, how they react, what goes on in their heads. Now he's doing it specifically for officers, which is improper, Your Honor. Mr. Robles?
What I asked was what he wrote about. So it's not asking what any particular officer, the officer's state of mind. It's what he wrote about and essentially why he understands these concepts because of his research and his writing.
I'll allow him to testify as to what he wrote about.
Now, in your manual, Reasonable and Unreasonable Fear in Police Encounters, what did you say?
The training goes to the preparation of police officers to respond to violence and what officers need to do themselves to prepare for proper response to violence. And then when officers act out unreasonably, what are those keys or cues that supervision and other officers can recognize as someone who is being dominated by emotion, by fear, and not responding appropriately to the results that, not the results, the actions that are taking place.
How did you...
That's what I wrote about.
What was the basis for the conclusions you drew in your work, Reasonable and Unreasonable Fear in Police Encounters?
Same objection, Your Honor. Now we're getting into the research and the psychology under how people act and react.
Mr. Rowland?
I'm asking again about his publication that he wrote, and what was the basis for essentially a way in which a supervisor should view an incident, and also about the training to equip officers with regard to their response to a violent situation. So this particular training key, and again, this is a training key, has a foundation. And what is that foundation? Because then this training was subsequently taught. So it's not just simply, I did this without consultation to resources. And so what are those resources, and what is the basis for the essential training keys that he developed?
Well, what I'm concerned about, and I don't want to get into now the psychology of things, and I don't think that you offered him as an expert in the area of psychology, and it sounds like we're headed in that direction. So I'd ask that let's steer clear of that unless you can lay foundation that he has training in psychology and
Psychology. What was the basis of the training keys you developed for the paper entitled Reasonable and Unreasonable Fear in Police Encounters?
The basis for it was that there is improper police performance or bad police performance, and that there are cues that can be recognized when somebody is incapable of handling chaos, handling confusion in an appropriate way. There are a variety of things that you can look for in a police officer's actions, whether he or she can withstand the kind of pressure.
What exactly are those cues that you look for to make a determination as to whether an officer is acting according to their training or is acting in a way that's based on fear?
Objection, Your Honor. It sounds like he's asking, how do you know what's going on in an officer's head after the fact?
Well, I'll allow him to testify what those cues are, so I'll overrule the objection.
An officer being overly officious, badge heavy, if you will, reacting to something that doesn't require an officer to exercise a loud voice, loud commands. A case of the big eyes is what we call it, and that's what I termed it, where you see an officer and you can look at the facial expression and literally their eyes are wide and they begin to have physical responses that are jerky, spasmodic. They don't know where they're pointing their weapon if they have their weapon in their hand. And those kinds of things are very obvious cues, and police officers recognize them when they see them. And that tells you that that officer isn't trained, those cues, for that kind of event, or will never be able to be trained for that kind of an event. They shouldn't be police officers. So, case of the big guys. Circumstances where a police officer is utilizing physical force when they don't have to utilize physical force. Or if they're justified in reaching out and turning somebody around and controlling an arm, they reach out and turn somebody around and then slam them up against a wall when it's not appropriate. It may be appropriate to slam somebody against the wall. So these kinds of things that people in law enforcement, police officers do that are recognized by, if you're looking, most of us to be an example of a problem, and we want to recognize it before the problem grows.
Now, you also wrote a document for the Department of Justice in 1990 called Fear, It Kills, a monograph and training guide on police-related fear. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
What basically did you state in that document on behalf of the Department of Justice?
Objection, hearsay.
I'll allow him to answer the question. Overruled.
Would you ask me the question again? I'm sorry.
Would you please tell us the points that you make in the the document, Fear, It Kills, a monolith and training guide on police-related fear?
I used a example to try to explain what can occur with police officers and why they have to be given the opportunity to succeed and control fear. And I call it walking the curb. We all can walk a curb. We can stand on it and put one foot in front of another, and the curb is about 6 or 7 inches high, and it's easy. Now, theoretically, if that curb goes 100 feet in the air, it's still the same curb, but now we have a totally different perspective while we're trying to walk it. And the fact that we weren't prepared and never had trained to walk that curb 100 feet in the air, predictably we're going to fail and we're going to fall. And so that's an example, and the one I wrote, and I don't know if that's one of the things you're referring to. So it's important that we teach people how to handle the curb.
Okay. So it'd be fair to say that in order to reasonably, or to train an officer reasonably, one has to essentially inoculate an officer to the types of critical incidents that he or she might encounter during their career.
Yes, and they must be given realistic training and put into positions in training that, as close as you can, represent the pressure, the noise, the confusion. Scenario training is an example, and it's done all the time in law enforcement in different ways. You do that with negotiators and training negotiators. You put them in a scenario situation with a difficult person to deal with who is exhibiting really bizarre response back to the negotiator. And the more real you can make the training, the better predictability you have of an officer succeeding in real life.
Now, you have been tasked by the United States Department of Justice to evaluate the special response capabilities of the U.S. Department of Justice. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you did that in 1993.
Yes, sir.
Now, in 2000, you wrote an article, Procedures and Tactics for Patrol and SWAT Responses to Active Shooters.
Yes, sir.
Now, you then have authored, I believe, 2 books. Is that right?
Three.
Three books. There's the Management of Police Specialized Tactical Units. Is that one of those books?
Yes, sir.
And that was published in 2000.
Yes, sir.
You also then worked on the Management of Police Specialized Tactical Unit, 2nd edition.
Yes, sir.
And is this the 3rd one? The Significant Tactical Cases, Learning from the Past Events to Improve Future Responses.
Yes, sir. And I had a co-author, Dr. Tom Majerus, who's a professor at Texas State University.
And I understand that that last book was authored in 2015.
That's correct.
Now, how many times have you been, how many times have courts determined that you should be an expert witness in cases?
Probably conservatively about 180 to 200 times.
Okay. Now, is it fair to say that you only testify on behalf of police officers?
No, sir.
Why is that?
I have a case in Memphis, Tennessee, where I'm testifying against the Memphis, Tennessee SWAT team.
Okay. How often have you testified against police officers?
Approximately 4 times, 3 or 4 times, not very often.
How often do plaintiffs' lawyers or prosecutors approach you about cases against police officers?
Not very often. The last count over since 1993, there were, I believe it was 23.
Because you've often testified against or for police officers, would it be fair to say that you have a bias in favor of police?
Objection, bolstering.
I'll allow him to answer the question.
I'm sorry, would you ask it again?
Because you often testify on behalf of police officers, would it be fair to say you have a bias in favor of the police?
No. I like police officers. A son and daughter and a grandson are police officers. However, I don't like police officers that do the wrong thing.
Now, turning your attention to the facts in this case, I understand you reviewed a series of documents, is that right?
Yes, I have.
Would it be fair to say that you reviewed the offense and incident report, the police report for this case?
Yes.
And you reviewed all of the photographs that were taken by the criminalist in this case, criminalist?
Yes, I did.
You also reviewed a series of videos that were given to you?
Correct.
Including the helmet camera video of Officer Perez?
Yes.
You also reviewed a number of depositions that were taken in a civil case, is that right?
Yes, sir.
You reviewed, I believe, the deposition of Officer Weimerskirch,
Yes.
deposition of Officer Fox,
Yes.
deposition of Officer Ingram.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I'd like to talk about how you reach opinions about cases. Do you have a method by which you analyze cases and reach opinions about what happened in those cases and whether it was consistent with training and your experience?
Yes, sir.
What is that?
First, I read the material. It varies in terms of what the lawyers that have commissioned me to review the case. And I don't take cases until I've had an opportunity to read enough of it to know whether I can or not. And so I don't have a retainer. And I will give the case back, and I won't charge somebody if I can't work for them. The materials that I'm provided, I hope that I get, first and foremost, the investigation itself. And oftentimes there's more than one investigation. There's an internal affairs investigation, a homicide investigation, and sometimes an independent investigation. And so I like to look at those first, and then my next step is to compare the complaint and the alleged complaint with the investigation and how they differ from one from the other. And then I go through the last thing I look at is the videos and the photos.
Why are the videos and the photos the last thing you look at?
Because they tell you a lot. There's no question, but videos are extremely valuable, and videos of incidents are extremely valuable, but I feel more comfortable in having all of the investigative facts and all of the allegations and have those in mind and in hand with my notes, and then look at the videos, and I can evaluate in my mind better and more accurately once I've done it that way.
Now, turning your attention to the incident, and the first thing I was going to ask you about is the encounter that the two open space officers had with Mr. Boyd. Did you review those portions of the police report that help you understand the facts underlying the initial encounter by the two open space officers with Mr. Boyd?
Yes, sir. Hernandez and McDaniel?
Yes, sir. What is your understanding, based on the review of the documents, about the encounter that happened between Officer McDaniel, Officer Hernandez, and Mr. Boyd?
My understanding was that they had responded to a radio call that had originated from a citizen's complaint from one of the citizens that lived in the area, and when they made contact with Mr. Boyd, he acted out in a threatening manner, so much so that Officer McDaniel made a crime report to that extent, that he had threatened the officers.
Now, with the court's permission, if you would switch the monitor to the prosecution table so we could play a video. We are going to play what has been previously marked Exhibit B4, and that's a portion of Alexander Thixton's video compilation, which has already been admitted into evidence, but we're not going to play the sound pursuant to the court's ruling.
Are we talking about
What I termed as the commentary, and or are we talking about the sound from the scene?
Well, I don't know how to do it without removing both, unfortunately.
Okay, because previously we had played the sound from the scene, but yesterday we had some discussions about commentary.
As I understood it, Ms. McGinn's staff was able to somehow filter out commentary, but leave the sounds of the scene, something that we're not able to do, unfortunately.
Okay.
But if I could always ask the court to essentially disregard those statements which the court believes to be hearsay, and instead, or hearsay or inadmissible, and then focus only on those sounds which are part of the scene, and that may assist the trier of fact.
Just play it without the sound if you can't separate the commentary on the tape.
What I'd like to do now then is play a portion of Exhibit B4 from the 23rd second to the 2-minute 9-second mark. Based on your training and experience, what did you see in this video that helped you make a determination of whether these officers acted in a manner that's consistent with the training which you believe is appropriate?
The training that officers receive is that when they're in contact with a uncooperative subject who appears to be armed and is acting out in such a way that he appears to be assaultive or will be assaultive, that the officers should create distance in order to establish a reaction time factor that will be more on their side rather than the subject in case they need that, and that they should present a weapon when they believe that the subject is armed. That's appropriate, and they should present it in an appropriate manner. You can see that one officer here, and I believe it's Officer McDaniel, is at what I would call a high ready. And he's the officer in front. And then Officer Hernandez, who's just behind him, is at a low ready. Which officer feels more compelled to be the first one to respond? The one in front. That is why you see the officer behind at low ready. That's training. That's what officers nationwide are trained to do. And I think they're talking to him. That's what it appears to be. I don't know what the words that they're using are, but they don't seem to be pressing him. As a matter of fact, they backed up. I noticed that Officer Hernandez at one time put his hand up in a manner that we all interpret as, whoa, slow down, stop, or don't come any closer. I couldn't see what Mr. Boyd was doing, but it was obvious that he did that. Just another way of communicating, other than verbalization.
Let me pose a hypothetical to you. If an officer in investigating a situation in which there's a homeless individual who, when encountered, has a hand that's not immediately visible, and after being asked to show that hand, does not do so, what would a reasonably well-trained officer do in response to a situation in which someone doesn't immediately show a hidden hand?
When officers verbally direct somebody to provide their hands so that the officers can see that they're not armed, and that's refused, the officer is trained to assume that the subject may be armed, to make that assumption. It's a reasonable assumption when somebody fails to display their hands when they're asked to. We once did a casual field study of how many people won't show their hands when they're asked to, and after we had gone through 200 stops, I gave up because 200 out of 200 showed their hands. So most people do show their hands, and it's highly unusual when somebody doesn't cooperate with that order.
What's so important for a reasonably well-trained officer? Why is it so important for that officer to see hands? What is it about a hand that makes them dangerous?
Officers are trained to concentrate and focus on hands. They want to see the whole thing because there are other things that they need and they're trained to look at. Waistbands, places where they're trained that subjects carry concealed weapons, bulging pockets, what have you. But the hands are the things that can injure officers and pick up weapons and present them. And reaction time, somebody can present a weapon faster than the officer can respond if they have a weapon in their hand and it happens to be a firearm.
Let me pose a different hypothetical to you. Upon encountering this homeless person who wasn't immediately compliant with the demand to show the hand, and then an officer sees what he believes to be a folding knife in that pocket, what does a reasonably well-trained officer do upon seeing someone who's present who has what they believe to be a folding knife in their pocket?
Well, an officer would tell him to cooperate and would give him commands to put the officer in a position of advantage where the officer could deal with that. Keep your hands out of your pockets. They'd be trained to say that. Keep your hands out of your pockets. Ordinarily, you would say turn around, slowly walk backwards. You couldn't do that here. You could see the officers trying to back up and create distance, and they have to look over their shoulder and take their eyes off the suspect.
Well, why is that a problem, to take your eyes off the suspect while trying to basically figure out where you're going to take your next step.
Well, if I could stand up,
With the court's permission, Your Honor?
if I could. If I don't have a weapon in my pocket, I have this item here, but I can present that weapon that fast and shoot. So therefore, taking my eyes off of the subject, back up down that rocky environment there, and taking my eyes off the suspect for a second and a half, if we're dealing with a firearm, which we weren't, fortunately, there's no way the police officer can defend his life. He just has to deal with it. And so the presentation of a weapon in a pocket, when hands are in the pocket, it can be done extremely fast. And I'm 78 years older. I used to be faster, but so my point being, the presentation of a pistol can happen in the blink of an eye, and that's why it's so important to understand reaction time and what people can do and what they can't do.
Thank you. Now, what about the attempt made by these officers to pat down? Now, I'd like to have you further assume, for this hypothetical, that upon seeing a folding knife, the officers then had the suspect turn around and an attempt was made as to a false touch, and in order to determine whether it would be safe to pat someone down. Based on your training experience, is that a reasonable response by an officer?
You said a false touch?
False touch.
I'm not sure what that means. That false touch.
So, determining whether the suspect's reactivity by a touch that isn't going to be followed by a pat down. Have you had training on something like that?
I don't use that, so I'm not familiar with it.
Okay. Well, let's change the hypothetical then. Would it be appropriate, based on your training experience, for an officer to attempt to pat down a suspect who he saw having essentially what is a folding knife in his or her pocket?
Yes, you can, but you'd have to control the hands first.
Okay.
You're trained to control the hands first. So
how
you
is
would
that
put the subject in a position and his hands in a position where you could do that.
How is that done?
It can be done in a variety of ways. Place your hands behind your head, interlace your fingers, and then if I hold those fingers and I don't squeeze them too tight because it can be very painful, I hold them. If the subject is going to try to assault me, the officers are trained that you'll feel the subject tighten up, usually, and begin to tighten up and move his hands, and that's a signal that you have to find a way of controlling him or to create distance and push him vigorously away. So the hands can be behind the head, or the hands can be behind the back and the small of the back, with the fingers laced. So the officer with his support hand or weak hand would hold the fingers and search with his strong hand as far as he can, and now he's evaluating the cooperation or the lack of same from the subject. Then he would switch hands. They're all trained to do it around the United States in a similar fashion. Now, you also evaluate people, and we don't always search everybody we stop. We don't always give them that kind of a search and have them lace their fingers. It would depend on the subject evaluating that individual. If it's a female, the officers, male officers, are trained not to search.
Okay.
If you don't search a female.
Let me add another fact into the mix. For our purposes, let's assume in this scenario that we're posing that it was later found out that this individual was mentally ill. In what way, if any, based on your training and experience, should an officer handle a situation like this differently?
When you evaluate somebody as having emotional problems and or mentally ill, and that's a conclusion that you've come to, then you're going to maintain distance and try to gain cooperation through conversation, through verbal strategies. And that's your first effort. That's what you're going to do. Just what I saw in this video. They maintained distance. They didn't start climbing up the hill. And it appeared to me that they were talking to him and he was talking back to them.
But you would agree with me that in order to determine whether someone should handle someone as someone who is emotionally disturbed, you first have to know that they are.
Yes.
Now, in your review of this incident, and as the officers approached him, what evidence, if any, did you find in your review of the documents to suggest that these officers should have known, based on their training and experience, that Mr. Boyd was mentally ill?
Once the conversation over time, and I wouldn't suggest that the first two officers would make that conclusion, but once the conversation over time ran from reality, and that the subject is making statements that are obviously bizarre and don't have any connection with fact or truth or realism, then you know you're talking to somebody that's got emotional problems.
Now, turning your attention back to the video, and based on what you've developed in terms of cues that identify whether an officer is reacting based on their training or reacting based on fear, what cues, if any, did you see in the video that indicated the officers were being governed by fear and not training?
Objection, Your Honor. I think we're getting right into that issue that we're concerned about. He's asking him, what did you see in the video that tells you what was in their mind?
The cues were objective items, like, for example, a weapon that was moving back and forth, as an example. So these are objective cues that are trained upon, that supervisors use to make assessments about whether an officer is behaving based on their training or acting out of fear. And again, these are objective cues. This isn't about the state of mind, but what the officers demonstrated in the video and what we can learn from just watching the video.
Anything else?
Yes, Your Honor. What he's saying is, what objective cues did you see in the video that tell you what was going on in this officer's mind? And that's precisely the kind of evidence we've asked not be elicited through this witness. It should have come in on direct through Officer McDaniel when he was here. It may, depending on how things go, come in through Mr. Lewinsky if he testifies. But this witness is not appropriately qualified. He conceded he's not a psychologist. And we've objected over and over again and been assured that this was not the kind of thing that we're going to be hearing based on this testimony from the witness.
This part of it, Mr. Robles, I am concerned about, because I think it goes more to psychology and what's going on in officers' minds at that time, and I don't feel that there's been sufficient foundation laid for this witness to testify as to that aspect of it. So in that respect, I'll sustain the objection.
What behaviors were you able to see from the officers by watching the video to show that they were acting consistent with their training?
The presentation of a pistol. Both officers were presenting a pistol in the manner in which they're trained to nationwide. They were at a low ready until there was some kind of action that changed that, and you could see the lead officer, McDaniel, go to a high ready. Officers are trained to keep their finger off the trigger. Couldn't see that. Don't know. And the finger is along the slide until you're on target and intending to shoot. So don't know about that, but they're trained that way. And the movement, their body movements, were consistent with good training. They were creating distance. There, a good portion of the time, we couldn't see Mr. Boyd, but we saw the officers back up. We saw the hand of Officer McDaniel go up and hold it or stop motion. I couldn't see what Mr. Boyd was doing. But all of that is something that you can observe and if you're familiar at all with police training, what they were doing was consistent with what officers are trained to do with a subject that they can see is dangerous.
In a hypothetical, if a subject is armed with a weapon and makes a statement that the suspect intends to use the weapon, is it appropriate to hold the weapon in the high ready?
There's absolutely nothing wrong with high ready under these circumstances. Plus, we have to understand that Mr. Boyd was up in an elevated position, which gets you to a high ready. If you're pointing the pistol 3 or 4 feet in front of him, you'd still be at a higher ready than you would be if we were on a flat surface. We would, and a high ready is not a problem as long as you're not searching in a confined space. High ready takes our ability to see peripherally away from anything that's close to us, 3 or 4 feet in front of us, especially in a cramped or a dark environment, because I'm now focused over my hands and the weapon, and that will block what's 4 or 5 or 6 feet in front of me. That's not relevant in a lot of cases, and wasn't relevant here because they weren't going to be moving forward.
Now, to change the hypothetical a bit, let's assume that this police department, in dealing with an individual who's armed with a weapon, a knife, and has threatened to harm officers who initially responded, then backup is sent. In your opinion, what should that police department do in terms of providing personnel necessary to deal with the situation I've just described?
The police department should, the police officers should be trained, and the training is to request backup and assistance when they're not able to resolve the situation, and it's at this point in time a stalemate. And there's safety issues, citizen safety, number one. There is safety issues here that officers have to take into consideration regarding citizen safety, and they are trained and they're supposed to be trying to resolve the thing without any injury to the person that's presenting them with the threat and the problem.
How many officers, based on your training experience, how many officers should respond to a call such as the one involving James Boyd after his initial confrontation with the open space officers?
The issue is not the number of officers. The issue is, are the officers that respond, are they doing professional things, right things? I can have 10 officers there or 5 officers there, and they don't know what they're doing and they're screwing the operation up. Or I can have 100 officers there and they're under control and they're not doing anything that is going to exacerbate the situation. It's not been my experience that the number of officers is going to create an issue. It's what the officers are doing.
Now, in this hypothetical, where the Albuquerque Police Department sent officers, why is it appropriate to send an officer who has a less lethal tool such as a beanbag shotgun?
Officers are trained with a series of options, and less lethal extended range impact, less lethal tools come in a variety of forms, 12 gauge being one that's usually carried by patrol cops, and then there's 37 and 40 millimeter extended range impact, which works the same way, more effective over a longer distance. The 12 gauge shotgun is going to be reasonably effective out to about 60 feet, and then there's a significant drop-off.
Is it your understanding that in this particular case there was an officer deployed who was armed with a beanbag shotgun?
Yes, sir.
Now, with regard to sending CIT officers, first, what is your understanding of what CIT is and what these officers bring to a situation that a typical patrol officer may not?
CIT trained officers and CIT training is a knockoff of negotiations and a recognition that's taken place recently over in law enforcement that verbal skills and verbal strategies have to be taught to officers, and recognition has to be taught to the officers how to recognize problem people and then verbal strategies that they can employ to deal with those problem people. And so that training came into being it started about 18 years ago, and now it's pretty much nationwide. The problem in law enforcement is every single patrol officer, it'd be nice if they had critical incident training, but it all costs money and time, and so therefore they have to do it one at a time. You may not have a critical incident trained officer available. So that's a problem that law enforcement has. Fortunately, there was that availability here.
Now, with regard to negotiating with an individual, have you had an opportunity to listen to the taser camera videos and analyze what negotiation tactics and techniques were being used with Mr. Boyd?
Yes, sir.
What is, based on your training experience, what is your opinion about the efforts being made and whether they were reasonable given the training these officers had received?
Based on everything that I'm familiar with in terms of what I was trained to do and what I trained police officers to do, what they were doing was reasonable. It was obvious that they were trying to resolve this through verbal strategies, and they were utilizing calming influence and trying to talk Mr. Boyd into submission. They weren't screaming at him. Something you shouldn't do. They don't train you to do it, is to scream, "Put the bleeping knife down or I'll shoot you." That they didn't do that, and that isn't what they should have done.
How reasonable is it for these officers during the course of negotiations to continue to ask Mr. Boyd to drop his knives or to relinquish his knives, even though it began to agitate him and in some instances it really annoyed him?
At a certain point in time, the effort to try to get somebody to calm down and they become agitated, you may be stuck with that, and that's just something you have to deal with. It's not something that you can do anything about, and you do have to try to get him to act out in a rational manner and to try to talk him out of deadly weapons that can seriously injure or kill an officer. So they're going to have to talk about that, whether they like it or not. It's how they deliver the message, and hopefully he responds to it. If he doesn't respond to it, that doesn't mean that they should stop. If he becomes agitated, as long as they're asking in an appropriate fashion and trying to keep the situation calm through tone of voice and what they're saying, the words they use, there isn't an issue and a problem there, in my opinion.
Now, turning your attention to a different topic, and that is containment. In law enforcement, what is containment and what goal does it serve?
First of all, containment, there's a variety of different levels of containment. There's inner containment and outer containment. And generally speaking, most things need both. And sometimes you have 3 layers of containment. In this particular circumstance, the outer containment would be those officers who were deployed outside of what you see mostly on camera here. And then there's the containment that is there in close proximity to him, the tactical containment that is being provided. So inner containment, outer containment.
Now, in this case that you reviewed, what were your opinions about whether the officers contained Mr. Boyd in a manner that was consistent with training and your experience?
It appeared to be appropriate to me. Officers are trained in outer containment to take up positions where they can hopefully observe a little bit of the suspect. You can't always. An outer containment in a residential neighborhood may not allow you to see the suspect, depending upon the circumstances. But hopefully you've received a description of the suspect, and if he happened to appear in proximity to your containment position, you would challenge him. The containment is also to keep from people coming into an area and exacerbating the situation. It's both.
Now, I
people
understand
going in and people coming out.
Now, I understand in your review of a certain video, you identified some concerns with regard to citizens who were in the area. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Now, what I'd like to do now, Your Honor, is play a portion of an exhibit that's already been admitted, Exhibit B4, Alexander Thixton's video from the 9-minute 4-second mark to the 9-minute 18-second mark. And after that, play a second clip from the 30-second 19-second mark to the 30-minute 37-second mark.
Okay.
Based on your training and experience, how would a reasonably well-trained police officer and supervisor assess the concerns that were identified in these videos?
Well, they would make a determination that there is a possibility of citizen safety being jeopardized because we saw a jogger apparently on one of the only flat places there who was jogging, and then we see what appears to be, I don't know if it's a family or friends who are up in the hills, and they're just becoming aware that there's something going on there, and you can see them looking. So therefore, there is the potential for people unknowingly stumbling into an environment where they could be injured.
What concerns does that raise for a reasonably well-trained supervisor or officer about someone stumbling into a situation?
That you would want to have sufficient deployment so that you could prevent anybody from intruding into a tactical area where there might be injury. So officers are trained, as I said earlier, to contain the subject, but also to keep the problem from being exacerbated by outside influence. And again, citizens putting themselves at risk when they don't know.
Now, in looking at the videos and your experience having lived in Albuquerque, what concerns would a reasonably well-trained officer have about the environment, the terrain that they were facing in dealing with Mr. Boyd?
That area there is extremely difficult for people to move in, and that's obvious by watching the video. And he had an area that he had established for himself that was a bit of a plateau, if you will, with the rock formation surrounding it, a small flat area where he set up his campsite. Any place else, it would be very difficult for police officers to move with any level of rapidity and ease in order to respond to anything that might occur. And so it's a difficult environment to move in, especially taking into consideration darkness, and darkness was on coming up, and that would make it really difficult.
What concern does the oncoming nightfall have for the officers who are responding to the situation involving James Boyd?
Well, first of all, trying to contain subjects in darkness is very difficult in the best of circumstances. A residential district with street lights and a one-story housing area, and subjects are surrounded by the police many times, and once the officers enter, because nothing has happened and they have to make an entry to determine what's occurred with the suspect, and the house is empty. The suspect has eluded the officers in the darkness, even though there's ambient light, street lights. In an environment like this, it's reasonable to conclude that the subject could leave the control of the police perimeter once it got dark and the police officers wouldn't see it. He could leave the control of the police perimeter and run into a citizen and misinterpret a circumstance, and somehow the citizen gets injured. Or the citizen somehow puts himself in a position and the subject injures him. So all of that is things that police people are trained to take into consideration while they're trying to deal with the subject.
Now, turning your attention to that point in the incident in which a state police officer was brought in, would you please explain your understanding of why the state police officer was brought in and that role of the state police officer?
It was my understanding that he wanted the state police,
When you say he?
meaning Mr. Boyd, wanted the state police to come to the scene, and the state police did. And there were two, a state police officer named Bankston and a sergeant named Ware. And I did see a video of Bankston, which is relevant, him trying to get to the scene.
What do you mean by that? Why is the video you reviewed from Officer Bankston relevant to your opinion in this case?
That unknowingly, and Mr. Boyd didn't intend this, but Bankston, in order to respond to this situation, was driving on a two-lane road at about 98 miles per hour. He was putting himself at risk for the benefit of Mr. Boyd. Police officers are supposed to do that. He's responding. I'm sorry.
Foundation.
Pardon?
Foundation.
Sustained.
Now, you had an opportunity to review Officer Bankston's role, is that right?
I did have that opportunity, yes.
Okay. What is your opinion, based on your training and experience, about Officer Bankston's efforts to try and negotiate a peaceful resolution with James Boyd?
I think what he tried to do was reasonable, and so was Sergeant Ware, both. And it didn't seem to impress Mr. Boyd. He rejected them.
Okay. Now, turning your attention to essentially the end of this incident, I wanted to talk to you about how law enforcement nationally and based on your training and experience essentially puts together what is known as a less lethal layered response, and what that is.
Yes, sir. Less lethal layers really means we're putting more than one less lethal option in place to utilize, recognizing that nothing works all the time. Not even deadly force. And so therefore, where we have the opportunity and we have the equipment, that we will put more than one less lethal solution in place and try to utilize it if we can, in case the first choice doesn't work.
You had an opportunity to watch Officer Pettis' helmet camera video, is that right?
Yes, sir.
So you had an opportunity to actually see the less lethal layered response that was used in this case.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to first talk to you about what is known as a flash noise diversionary device. What is it? What is that device?
A flash noise diversionary device is a explosive that doesn't fragment, so therefore it's not going to injure anybody if it's used appropriately. It deflagrates is the word. It consumes itself. It's a very loud noise, 174 to 178 decibels, under that which would ordinarily injure an adult's ears, but very, very loud. And a pressure wave of 1.63 pounds per square foot, but that isn't relevant here because it was deployed outside. And a very bright flash, which again, in daylight doesn't really have an effect. Well, in the darkness, it's very bright. It's 6 to 8 million candle power. So it causes a blind spot factor for about 20 to 30 seconds. And what it usually does, 70% of the time when it's deployed, the noise will cause somebody to fall to the ground, to duck. And if one went off in this room unexpectedly, some of us would be on the floor. And everybody would duck down. Very few would stand straight up.
How unusual is it for someone to be unaffected by a flash noise diversionary device?
About 7 out of 10 people respond by going to the ground. So it's unusual, but there is a 30% chance that somebody won't respond that way.
Now, in your opinion, based on your review of the evidence in this case, was the use of a flash noise diversionary device consistent with the training that you would expect these law enforcement officers to have?
Absolutely, no question.
Why is that?
First of all, it's a less lethal effort to try to resolve something that our verbal strategies failed. It didn't work. So we have to move to another effort, another solution. And so to deploy something that's 70% of the time going to work and is not going to be injurious in any way is a reasonable act on the part of the police.
Okay. Now, based on your training and experience in watching the video, why did the flash noise diversionary device not have its intended effect?
Objection, speculation.
I believe it's in his realm of expertise. I'll allow him to answer the question.
The general reason why a distraction device won't work, the first and foremost reason that isn't applicable here, in my opinion, is that people are under the influence of drugs to the extent that they don't react the way people ordinarily react. In the case of somebody who is resistant to the police and they don't respond the way 70% of the people that they're used against, is that he has a significant level of resistance and is a problem because he isn't acting like 70% of people do.
So, if I understand you correctly, is it fair to say that someone who has an awful lot of fight in them oftentimes will not be,
Objection, Your Honor.
Grounds?
Again, we're talking about psychological principles. Somebody who has an awful lot of fight in them will not psychologically respond to this device.
I'll allow the witness to answer, based on his experience, why some people do not react to these particular devices. So overrule it.
Somebody who is significantly resistant and doesn't react that way, that 70% of the time they go to the ground, would mean that that subject is formidable. It may be a well-trained military person who has emotional problems and they've got a broad military experience, and so therefore a loud noise isn't really going to cause them a problem. And it isn't going to work on them. They will be used to the chaos and the noise. So it makes any reasonable person believe we need to go to step 2 because this individual was able to overcome that, and it is an indication that he's a significant problem.
I'd like to ask you about the taser shotgun. What is a taser shotgun?
It's a electronic device that works through the discharge of about 50,000 volts of electricity, very low amps, so it isn't going to kill anybody, but if the probes make appropriate contact, it causes what you would describe when you have a cramp in your leg. That cramp happens throughout your whole body, and it's extremely difficult to resist, and generally speaking, it's non-injurious. People won't be injured by it. There has been injuries. People can fall and hit their face, but it's about 94% effective when the probes make contact with the person.
So first and foremost, there is the need to have the probes make contact. Based on your training and experience and given Mr. Boyd's layer of clothing, was it a reasonable decision to try and use the taser shotgun given the clothing Mr. Boyd had?
Yes, sir. You have a better opportunity with layered clothing. However, the layered clothing is an issue. If you will, it's a wall against anything that you're utilizing that is impacting in the target. Layered clothing and enough clothing will cause extended range impact to be less effective, as well as any taser device.
Okay. Would a reasonably well-trained officer, after having seen the layers of clothing Mr. Boyd put on, still use the taser shotgun?
Yes, sir, you would try, because the next level of force that you're going to use will create injury, where the other choices are not likely to create any kind of significant injury. And I'm referring to the canine.
Okay.
All of us know that if you're bitten by a canine, you're seriously injured.
Now, let's talk about the police service dog that was used in this case. What is the purpose of using a police service dog to what is the purpose of using a police service dog in a situation like that involving James Boyd?
Well, the purpose is to keep from having to use more force and to keep Mr. Boyd and his resistance and the threat he posed from causing Mr. Boyd more serious injury. So we're sending the dog as an effort to do that. And the dog is a distraction. Usually people focus on the dog that's moving towards them, and taking the focus away from the takedown team, swarm team, there's a number of names for that. So the dog is a distraction. The dog is something that is significant in terms of occupying the subject, and usually dogs can take a suspect down to the ground. And then you can take them into custody.
In your experience, how successful are police service dogs that are sent on a bite command, a bite and hold command, in terms of controlling a suspect?
They're usually successful. They can be counted upon, and they're usually successful.
Now, based on your training and experience, was it appropriate to use a police service dog to try and take Mr. Boyd into custody?
Yes, sir.
Why is that?
Because of his resistance and the threat he posed. The man's a deadly threat, and it's appropriate for officers to use less lethal tools with a deadly force backup. All less lethal is deployed always. The training nationwide is you must have deadly force backup for less lethal application.
Let me ask about that. Now, it's your understanding in this case that 2 police officers served as lethal cover, is that correct?
Yes.
Based on your training and experience, was it appropriate for those officers to serve in that capacity?
Absolutely.
Why is that?
First of all, here we go again in terms of citizen safety, number one, and then officer safety is my second concern, and that concern means that I am obligated as a trainer or as a tactical supervisor to ensure that I have a method of protecting those officers who are at risk of being injured. And so therefore, the training nationwide is to always put lethal solution in place in case the situation goes south, if you will, and evolves into a larger threat. And so you would always deploy lethal force to respond if that's what the subject presents.
Now, in this case, would it be fair to say that you reviewed Officer Pettis' statement in the criminal investigation?
Yes, sir.
Without revealing what Officer Pettis said, based on your training and experience, was it appropriate for Officer Pettis to go to the position where he served as lethal cover with the amount of information that he knew at the time?
Yes, sir. Officers are trained that when they arrive on scene, we don't have to huddle up like a play in football. They arrive on scene, they have training, and their training is their plan, and they fill a void that they recognize and take up a position that is appropriate for them based on what circumstances are taking place there. So their training is their plan.
Would a reasonably well-trained police officer, before going to a position such as Officer Pettis did, conduct an investigation before moving up?
No, sir.
Why is that?
You go to see what the problem is and now you don't interrupt it, you don't intrude, but you go to the situation. SWAT officers are trained to go to the situation and make a quick assessment and then fill a position that is needed. And in filling the position of deadly force cover for officers who are in proximity to a potential deadly threat is certainly appropriate.
Now, based on your training and experience, were the use of less lethal options successful?
No.
Why is that?
In my opinion, based on everything I could conclude, the layers of clothing defeated the taser, and their deployment of the 12-gauge less lethal wasn't done at that time because it couldn't be, because of movement and activity of people. And then sending the dog was appropriate. The distraction device, I forgot to say that, that's part of the less lethal layers. And then the dog, for some reason, instead of doing what they usually do about 95% of the time, veered off and made contact with a bag that was there in the campsite.
Now, based on your training and experience, do you have an opinion as to whether Officer Pettis contributed to the failure of the less lethal plan working?
He did not.
Why do you say that?
Officer Pettis is responsible for protecting the lives of the police officers as they move toward a subject who is armed with deadly weapons. And that's his single responsibility, and he's not supposed to be doing anything else, and he can't do anything else. That's a significant responsibility, and that's what he should be focused upon, and that's all he did.
Now, turning your attention to the video footage, you've had an opportunity to watch the officer-involved shooting of James Boyd, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
But do you agree that that is not the point of view by which the officers involved in this case, specifically Officer Pettis, what his point of view was?
Yes, sir.
Based on your training experience, what would have been Officer Pettis' point of view?
Objection, Your Honor, speculation.
Approach for a second, please.
If you were to compare the view from Officer Pettis's helmet camera with the view one would have if they were looking through a sighting system, an aim-point sighting system is like the one that Officer Pettis has, what would be the difference in terms of a point of view?
Well, the biggest difference would be a reduction in your peripheral vision, your ability to see in a broad way. You would be seeing in a much more narrow way, not just because of the scope, but if you're focused on the red dot, if you're focused on the sight reticle on a scope and a hunting rifle, if you're focused on the front sight of a pistol or a rifle, you're not going to see things that happen in very close proximity to a subject. And you'll see the target somewhat fuzzy if you're seeing the sight system, whatever it happens to be, clearly. If I don't see the front sight or if I don't see the red dot clearly, I have a likelihood of missing. I'm looking at the target, not at the sight system. So that's just the reality, and officers are trained that way.
So let me ask you a fundamental question. Again, you've trained officers for decades regarding how to use sighting systems when teaching them firearms. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you've taught officers how to use aiming systems that are on top of firearms. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
And you've done that for decades.
Yes.
Now, how is a reasonably well-trained officer trained to essentially use their sights?
Depending upon the weapon, the main thing is to utilize the sight system and see the apparatus, if you will, the primary thing that you're supposed to focus on, to see that clearly, as I said earlier. And you focus over or through that particular sight system, depending upon what it is. And if your concentration and your training is all in one place, then you're going to have a high degree of accuracy.
So when you say you focus on the sighting system, let's assume that you're focusing through an aim point sighting system. Based on, well, how would a reasonably well-trained officer be trained to use an aim point sighting system?
He would be trained to, first of all, if he has not made up his mind to shoot, the weapon would be in a ready position, and he would be looking over the weapon at the problem. And much as we saw McDaniel and Hernandez doing. And then once we've made the decision, the target turns in training on the range, or the situation escalates to the point where we've made a decision to fire, then once that decision is made, the weapon comes up to the sight system and our eyes, and then the finger goes on the trigger. We've made the decision to shoot, and we begin to press.
How is a reasonably well-trained officer taught to focus on the red dot in an aiming system as opposed to focusing in on what the suspect is doing?
The whole purpose of being at a low ready is to make those observations so when you can see them clearly and you don't change that weapon's position until you have observed what you believe is a deadly threat, a threat for great bodily injury or death. And once you've made that decision, the weapon comes up, the finger goes on the trigger, and you're pressing. Once we know that we have our sight picture where we want it.
So is it fair to say that based on your training and experience that it's not appropriate to have your sighting system on a suspect until you know, with basically your eyes open, that a suspect poses an immediate threat of harm to somebody else, or is that right?
Yes, that's usually the way it works.
Now, you talked about essentially peripheral vision being removed. So if we have an aiming system, what are officers taught about how to deal with changes about what they see through their sighting system in terms of making decisions to use deadly force?
Well, they're trained that they make a decision to use deadly force, then there has to be a message to the officer that the officer can recognize and has the time to react to that. It's going to take, to use the decision to make to use deadly force is usually about a 3/4 if I'm ready and I have the weapon ready and I'm anticipating that I might be needed. I might have to use deadly force. Then if that is what I'm there for and I see that the situation has evolved and I need to intrude with deadly force, then it's going to take me about 3/4 of a second to do that.
Objection, Your Honor. Now we're getting into perception and reaction time and the mental processing of human beings and officers.
I'll allow this particular question and answer to stand overruled.
And officers are trained about reaction time. That's part of training. And how long it takes to do things. In terms of distance and in terms of what they can respond to and react to. If it takes 3/4 of a second to recognize that it's necessary to use deadly force, it takes something happening that the officer can recognize to stop shooting and recognize that the threat is over or the threat has changed.
Objection, Your Honor. We're into the same field here. Now we're talking about how long it takes an officer to perceive things, recognize things, react. Mental processing is, again, psychological testimony.
Well, I think the question had been answered previously, so I'll sustain this objection and disregard this last portion.
How are officers trained, or what are officers trained about the number of rounds that they should fire at a suspect who poses a deadly threat?
They're supposed to fire that number of rounds that needed to be fired until they can recognize that the threat is over, and that would change. They're trained to understand that significant hits, the murder of the FBI agents in Miami is an example. The subject had 11 body mass hits, 9 fatals, and he walked 26 feet to a location where FBI agents were hiding behind a car and from a distance of 4 feet murdered them with those kinds of injuries. The only thing that will give, officers are trained that their first shots generally should be body mass. The only thing that will give instant stop to a threat is a headshot that is well directed. That's the only thing that will guarantee immediate response. So they stop shooting when they can perceive the threat is over.
Okay. What are officers taught about suspects changing their position during what essentially is a deadly force encounter?
Well, officers are trained to understand that the situation can change, it can evolve, but the officer has to be able to recognize and interpret the change. And that would depend. If the suspect has been told to get on the ground and he gets on the ground, right now, gets on the ground, then the officer wouldn't shoot. If the suspect goes to the ground, the officer may stop shooting, he may not, depending upon whether the subject is still a threat or not, because the subject could still be a threat on the ground. So the fact that he just went to the ground doesn't mean that they would stop shooting.
Based on your review of the evidence in this case, you've been given an opportunity to review. What evidence, if any, did you find to suggest that James Boyd was surrendering at any point during the time before he was shot and while he was being shot?
There was no indication
Why do
that James Boyd was surrendering.
Why do you say that?
First of all, he never exhibited those physical movements or verbal utterances that would indicate surrender.
Objection, Your Honor. Once again, we're back into, when you looked at this tape and looked at what a person was doing, what do you think was in their mind? Okay, it's the same kind of testimony. He's now asking, when you see James Boyd and the movements he was making, what do you think he was thinking? What do you think he was doing?
Respond.
Well, I did not ask what James Boyd was thinking. I asked whether there was evidence that he found in his review of the documents and all the evidence that he reviewed that James Boyd was surrendering before the shots were fired and during the shots were fired. So it's asking for an objective review of what was there in the record.
I'll allow him to answer the question again. Based on his training experience that he's had, was there anything that suggested to him that Mr. Boyd was submitting to the police or surrendering?
The answer to that question is no.
Okay. What is the basis of your opinion?
That he did not, based on those actions that people exhibit when they're surrendering, he did not exhibit those actions that police officers are trained to recognize would indicate surrender. And those actions are typically raising hands. They show their hands and raise their hands that they're not a threat. If they've been told to get down on the ground, that they immediately get down on the ground. They hit the ground on their face. Or he says, hey, I want to give up. It happens all the time. If those things don't happen, there is no surrender indication on the part of anybody, and officers are trained to understand that. They're trained, if somebody wants to surrender, then let them. But based on my training,